Okay, doke. So if anyone has any issues at this point, I think this is the fourth one, right? The fourth session out of six, if I recall.
Yes, I
Um,
believe.
yeah, and so we should be on chapters 5 and 6. Should be finishing up chapter 5 because we started in on chapter 5 last week, and should be jumping into chapter 6. So I think my impression on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is basically site assessments. Chapter 5 is all the different materials, the product, the components that are part of the system. The component thing can be a little bit confusing. Why you would do one thing versus another. I think the site assessment is pretty intuitive. At least that's my sense of it anyway, is you just kind of come at that by what would I do if I were thinking about putting solar on my home? You know, what are the things I'm going to look at? And I'll just sort of use this. I'm going to flip through the book, like how much sunlight is available. Well, obviously, it depends. It depends on where you are in the country, and it also depends on where you're putting the solar panels. If you're putting them under a big oak tree, you're going to have less sunlight than if you're putting them out in the middle of a field. You know, that just makes sense. So you've got shading issues there. But if you're putting them in Phoenix, Arizona, you're going to have different amounts of sunlight than if you're putting them in Seattle, Washington. So you've got geographic issues there. The geographic issues are not as much as you would think. Let's say up in upstate New York, where the sun almost never shines, right? You're still only going to have, you're going to have about 2/3 the amount of sunlight as Phoenix, Arizona, you know, where you think it's just the sun is always shining. So you're going to have in the neighborhood of 4 hours of insolation as opposed to 6.2 hours or whatever in Phoenix. So anywhere on Earth is suitable for solar from a sunlight availability standpoint, from an insolation, in incoming solar radiation, insolation. So we use PV watts to determine how much sunlight is available at a specific location. It's a really handy tool. And obviously in the labs, you have the opportunity to practice with that. Just go into PV watts, plug in different numbers. The geography is going to play a role. So is the orientation, such as, and we would typically refer to that as azimuth. So where are you east to west? We're always going to want to try and face it as close to south as possible. You don't want these things facing north, because that's just not where the sun is in the northern hemisphere. But going from east to west, if you're facing due east, you're going to lose about 20% of the amount of energy than if you're facing south. So I get the question a lot. You know, I've got a barn and it's facing east and west. I've been told that's not suitable for solar. Well, it certainly is. It's just that you're going to have to put 20% more panels on that barn in order to get the same amount of solar as if it were facing south. And we see this east-west orientation a lot. So, so don't think that just because a building is facing east and west, it's no good. In fact, in many respects, it's often a really ideal situation, because even though it's facing east and west and you're going to get 20% less solar, you're going to get it consistently in the morning and in the afternoon. So depending on how your system is being developed, for example, as a standalone system, that might be very helpful, that you're getting a consistent amount of power over the course of the day. Whereas if it's facing south, you're going to get it more right around noon, less in the morning, less in the afternoon. So that's as far as PV watts, we use that, but there is insolation maps that are available, and no real reason to use those anymore. They're not very accurate. They're not very helpful. PV watts will give you much better data, and it'll give it to you on a granular level. So, you can go by zip code, you can go by address, and it will give you the amount of insulation that's available at that particular location. We're starting to see those numbers change and change increasingly often because of global climate change. Some parts of the country are getting more sunlight, some parts are getting less. So if you notice in some of the labs, if we're referencing a number in PV watts and you look it up and it's changed slightly, don't get all bent out of shape, because it seems to be doing that almost like weekly anymore, where the number is different than when I wrote the question. So really just kind of make sure you get close. Also, when we're talking about azimuth, the lines of declination, declination map is basically how does magnetic south vary from true solar south? Because south is not south, right? Magnetic south is different than true south, and it changes as you move across the country. So basically, right along the Mississippi River, magnetic south and true south are pretty close to the same. But the further out you get, like in upstate New York, you're going to be about 14 degrees off south when you're looking at a magnetic south. So you've got to make your adjustment. And you can, on a Solar Pathfinder, it's pretty easy to make that adjustment. If you've got a phone and you're using the app on the phone to find south, usually those apps have two settings. You can ask for solar or GPS, or you can use magnetic. Use the GPS. So that's just a reality of our world. The magnetic lines apparently are some sort of magnetic force, and it's not at the North Pole. It's actually a little glob of something that's underneath the crust of the Earth, and it's moving. It's like a liquid molten kind of thing. And it's somewhere closer to Alaska. It's off the coast of Alaska somewhere right now. And there have been occasions, throughout history where it's flipped, where the North Pole becomes the South Pole and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. They make it sound like it's this rapid thing that just one day it decided I'm going to, flip over. I suspect, and I haven't really researched this, but since this is moving, it probably moves, slowly from the north to the south and then back again, or just think of it as I don't know, like the yolk of an egg inside the shell. You don't quite know where it is, from the surface. Probably a really bad analogy. So if you're trying to figure out where to orient your panels, really within 12.5 degrees of south is the ideal if you're wanting to maximize solar gain throughout the year. So that little span of 25%, that's your ideal orientation. But for someone like Christy, where you're doing a standalone system, you're going to make those calculations differently than if you're doing a grid-tied system where you're trying to maximize production. Because with a grid-tied system, it doesn't really matter when you're using the power or when you're generating the power. What does matter is at the course of the year, you've maximized production and minimized consumption, because the grid acts like a big battery. But in a standalone system, it does matter, because you want to produce enough power so that on the month where you get the least sun, but you have comparatively high use. So you have to compare the two. You have to compare how much solar am I going to gain that month and how much power am I going to use. And then you find the ratio, the monthly ratio, where those are at its worst. And then you design the system based on the worst month, as opposed to just trying to equalize over the course of the year. So let's say, for example, that you designed your system, you did the analysis and you found out that December is your worst month. And that's not that unusual. because December typically has the least amount of sunlight, regardless of where you are. The days are shortest and it's always cloudy and dreary and everybody's looking for Santa Claus or whatever. And so you're getting the least amount of sunlight, but you might have relatively high electric bills, especially if you have electric heat. Then you're going to have extremely high electric bills. But if you're a farm, we find that we have high bills because you got to heat the water for the animals, things like that. So, and that's typically going to be electric. So December might be your biggest month, your worst case month. Well, when you start doing the orientation of the panels, you might want to put in a winter bias versus a summer bias. The summer bias is going to be flatter. Winter bias is going to be more vertical. And even though over the course of the year, having those panels at a higher angle might produce less energy over the course of the year, it produces it when you need it. You want the best production in the winter when you need it. And there's usually an advantage of having those panels at a steeper angle as well in those higher latitudes because the snow will just slough off of them. That might be a lot nicer than having maximum. If let's say you're in Niagara Falls or something, and you get 6 feet of snow, over the course of a winter. Well, if you've got flat panels, you're going to be out there shoveling 6 feet of snow off of those solar panels over the course of the winter. But if they're almost up and down, the snow's just going to slide off. You don't have to worry about that. So another thing to consider. One thing that we don't recommend, however, is let's say that you've got a roof. I'll sort of hold this up. Let's say that's your roof pitch, and this is your thing. This is your solar panel. Looks like it's a coaster because it's a coaster. All right, so you have the flush to roof, so you're going to want them offset, at a consistent angle, so that they're consistent. They're parallel to the roof. But if my roof angle is like that, and you decide I want to increase the angle, don't do that. Don't put your panels on a sloped roof. Follow the roof pitch. Do not try and put it at an increased angle on the roof, because there's just a lot of problems with that. First off, it looks ugly. And it's going to catch the wind in the back. It's going to put stresses on your roof. Keep it as a flush to roof. Now, a ground mounted system, yeah, you can adjust. Or if you have a flat roof, you can adjust the angle. But on a roof, follow the pitch of the roof. Well, that said, if you're putting it on a roof, guess what the angle of the array is going to be? It's whatever the roof is. I don't care what your maximum or your minimum is. That's just is what it is. What's the orientation? It's wherever your roof is facing. That's just what it is. So you're not going to be able to change that. An advantage of a ground mounted system is you can make those changes. You can suit the thing so that it fits exactly what you need. Whereas with a roof, you're gonna follow the pitch of the roof and you're gonna follow the orientation of the building. The disadvantage of a ground mounted system is it takes up space, and in a lot of places, people don't have that space to put it, especially in cities or suburban areas or whatever. And the other disadvantage is you got to build the structure that this thing is sitting on. So that adds cost. So ground mounted systems, for the most part, are more expensive than rooftop systems, just as a general guideline. All right, I'm taking a breath here. Does anybody have any questions about this or anything else? Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling here. All right, another thing with the rooftop mount, you're going to want to make sure that you give enough access. The rule is that you want 3 feet of clear walking space on each side and at the top of the array. So we're assuming it's a regular old pitched roof. Could be a shed roof or it could be a pitched roof like that. At the top, you need 3 feet of walking space. At the sides, you need 3 feet of walking space. At the bottom, they're not that fussy about it because they're figuring that you're not going to be walking there. You're just going to be up on a ladder. But it's good practices to set that back from the eave by about 16 inches. That's more for wind load than it is for access. The reason you need these walking spaces is really for safety. If your house is on fire, the firemen need to be able to walk on your roof, and they can't walk on the solar panels. So you need pathways that they can walk on. Now, at the top, they want you to have 3 feet, but if there's no panels on the other side, you can have 18 inches on both sides. So you could have an 18-inch walkway on the top as long as the other side of the roof is open, and you can have 3 feet on each side. So that's the way we space those as far as setbacks on a residential. Different types of interrow shading is an issue if you're having a ground mounted system and you've got 2 rows, or if you've got a ballasted system on your roof. You don't want the panels in front to shade the panels in back, so you need to separate those. And typically it's a 1-to-3 ratio. The further you go north, the further back, because the shadows are cast further. So again, in upstate New York, it might be a 1-to-4 ratio. In West Virginia, down there, it might be a 1-to-2.5, somewhere in there. But 1-to-3, you're going to be safe. So if the panels are 6 feet tall, you're going to want to go 18 feet back before you set up your second row, just to avoid that. And then the different types of mounting systems, typically there's rooftop mounted, there's ground mounted. The ground mounted can be a single pole. If it's a single pole, it's usually going to be, it can be sun tracking, for example. So it could be oriented, a single axis tracking system is going to either adjust during the day, so it's facing east in the morning and west in the afternoon, and it just moves that way. Or it could be dual axis, where it changes its pitch or its altitude based on time of year, and it changes its azimuth based on time of day. If it's a dual axis system, it's typically going to be a pole mounted system because it's got a pivot in 2 directions, and it could only do that if it's on a pole. Most systems, though, are going to be just simply fixed mount. The reason for that is cheaper. I mean, it's cheaper for sure, but also as soon as you start having some sort of mechanical device that's moving these panels, there is the opportunity for mechanical failure. And one of the really good advantages, or the big advantages of solar, is very low maintenance. So why would you spend that money, have this potential failure point? If you need more production, and tracking systems will provide more production, you can just add more panels. You know, that's usually the cheapest and best way. The time when tracking systems become a legitimate good option is if space is very, very limited. So that's really where that comes in. In here also, we talk about Solar Pathfinder. We talk about remote site assessments. All of those are, we've got some labs there that you can work with. The balance of systems, basically, there is balance of systems is everything except for the inverter and the solar panels. So in the olden days, they used to say, all right, there are 3 major cost components to a solar installation there as far as equipment, and panels are about 1/3 of the cost, inverters are about 1/3 of the cost, and everything else is about 1/3 of the cost. So we said panels, inverters, balance of systems, everything else. Well, panels and inverters have come down in cost, and everything else has either gone up or stayed the same. So balance of systems are becoming increasingly expensive compared to the other options. other items in the system. Now we divide balance of systems into two major categories. There's structural balance of systems and electrical balance of systems. So the structural is usually going to be the racking system, the footers that are on the roof or in the ground. If there's trenching, the trenching is going to be part of the balance of systems. So that's usually the structural. Then you get into electrical, and there you're talking about breakers, fuses, wires, disconnects, all of the electrical bit, conduit. Conduit could be structural, could be electrical. So those are how we break those things down. So just so that you're aware, a lot of this is just learning new languages. So that's what we're teaching you. We're teaching you French. Then there's boxes. I'm just sort of flipping through the book here. NEMA ratings. The ones that I sort of just bear in mind, memorize NEMA 3R. Those are going to be the outside boxes. That's typically what we use. You'll just want to make sure it's NEMA 3 or NEMA 4 rated for exterior components. Then there's also things like clear working space for all of these cabinets, boxes, switches, things like that. The last item in chapter 6, which is really kind of important. Well, it's not the last item, but an important item here is the load side versus supply side connections. And typically, load side connection is where you hook into the service panel. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. I'm going to bring up the whiteboard here since I so dearly love to do that. Let's see it. Share screen, whiteboard. All right. So a typical, and this is 9 times out of 10 when you're doing an installation, you're going to come from this, and we may have touched on this before, but it bears repeating. So we've got an inverter. From the inverter, we're typically going to go outside to an AC disconnect. And then from this AC disconnect, we're going to come back inside and we're going to hook into the service panel. And out here is where your meter is. The meter connects into your main. And we're going to hook into a double pole breaker here. So this is the last part of the system. This is the inverter output circuit of a standard grid tied system. All right. So this would be referred to as a load side connection because our connection point of our system is on the load side of the main disconnect. And in here, this is your main disconnect, this breaker that's connected to the meter. So what are the limitations that we can do here? Well, it depends on the service and the panel. Really commonly, this would be a 200 amp service panel. What they're referring to is the bus bar. The bar that all of these breakers connect to has a rating of 200 amps. Now we come into here with 200 amp service from the utility. So if my bus bar is limited to 200 amps and the breaker is coming in with 200 amps of power, you might assume we could not hook in here with more power because we've reached our limit. But the NEC has said we're going to have what we call the 120% rule. And what that means is you can actually feed that bus bar with 120% of its rating. Well, 120% of 200 amps is 240. So I could actually come in here with a 40 amp breaker from my array. But if I do that, I've got to locate the breaker as far away from the main disconnect as possible. The reason for that is you don't want to be doubling up power. All of this power is going to be leaving to go to loads at different breakers. And if I'm feeding in from this side and I'm feeding in from this side, I'm not going to be doubling up. At no point is this bus bar going to be exposed to more than the 200 amps. If I had this up next to here and all the loads were down below, I might overfeed that bus bar. So that's the 120% rule. So I can go to 40 amps under this scenario. Well, then what size wire would I use and what size array? Well, I could figure this out. We know that the power coming from the utility is 240 volts AC. Well, then the power coming from the inverter has to be 240 volts AC, right? It's got to match exactly what's out there on the grid. All right, so if it's 240 volts and 40 amps, it would be very tempting to just say, all right, 240 volts times 40 amps. And that's going to be, I got to figure this out. Right? Is that right? 9,600 watts. Did I do that right? Somebody talk to me.
I believe so.
Yep, I just did. Yeah, I just checked it with my calculator. Sad how dependent we are. All right, so 96. So you would be tempted to say, okay, the inverter could have an output of 9,600 watts or a 9.6 kW inverter. But you would be wrong because all of our wires and all of our breakers has to have that 1.25 NEC safety measure. So you don't want to size your things right up to the limit. Well, in this case, we would take 9,600 and divide it by 1.25. So I'm going to divide it by 1.25, and I end up with 7,680. 680. So that is the maximum. 7,680 watts is the maximum output of that inverter. So it turns out when you go out and look at inverters, you're going to see a lot of inverters that are 7.6 kW, and there's going to be a lot of them that are 3.8 kW. Well, those seem like weird numbers unless you understand the 120% rule. Because if it's a 200 amp service panel with 200 amp service from the utility, you're going to end up at a 7.6. If it's a 100 amp panel with 100 amp service, you're going to end up at 3.8. So that's going to be your load side connection. That's very standard, very typical for a residential system. Everybody clear on that? Gonna erase some of this. And then I'm gonna have a load side connection, or no, sorry, supply side connection. So how would we do this if our system was bigger? Let's say I have a system that's significantly larger than 7.6 kW. How would I hook it in under this scenario? Well, the best way to hook it in would be to do a supply side connection. And a supply side connection essentially says, I'm going to hook up on the supply side of the main disconnect. So it's got to be between your main and the meter. If I hook up on the other side of the meter, well, then I'm just feeding the grid and I'm not getting any credit for it. So I wouldn't bother with that. But a supply side connection, you're going to connect in here. And it can be either a tap or it can be a junction box or a bus bar or however you're going to do that. But it is going to be more expensive because you've got to shut off the electricity. You've got to come in and cut the wires, and typically you're going to require an electrician to do all of this. And then we're going to tap in here, and it's a process. Whereas a load side connection, all I have to do is just hook into this breaker. I can do it myself. I'll just turn off the main breaker. I'll put my breaker in, then I'll turn the main breaker back on. We're off and running. So load side's always going to be cheaper. But if the system is bigger, let's say I've got a 10 kW system here, and I just simply can't hook in here without replacing this whole unit, I might just do a supply side connection. So those are the two different types there. Load side, supply side. Supply side's always going to be a bit more expensive. Is that all clear as mud? All right.
Sure.
Yep. Isaiah, were you just saying it was clear, or did you have?
Clear as mud. Yep.
Clear as mud. Okay. And then we get into, in chapter 6, we get into a little bit of economic comparison. And these are good to just walk through. Really what you're going to find is the cheapest is typically going to be string inverter, just a regular string inverter, but it's not the most perhaps efficient. Optimizer systems, microinverter systems, they're going to be fairly comparable. And the smaller the system, the more I think I lean towards microinverters. These are grid-tied systems, of course. You get into a bigger system, maybe optimizer system works, and then the really big ones, string inverter systems work. The most expensive one you're going to run into is standalone. So aren't you lucky, Christy? You get standalone, and this is going to be significantly more expensive than a grid-tied system because you have to buy batteries. That's really where the cost is. Also, the inverters are more expensive for a standalone system. And I suspect that's just economy of scale because they sell a lot more grid-tied systems. So they make a lot more and they can charge less per unit just because they're selling. The standalone marketplace is a pretty niche market. There are only a few manufacturers out there in that marketplace. So you're going to pay a premium. And really the battery technology is where the super cost is. It used to be just a few years ago when we would talk about battery technology, we were talking about lead acid batteries. They were far and away the number one in what you would be installing. Today, very much the opposite. Now we're really focusing on lithium ion. So lithium ion batteries are going to be the 90% of what gets installed. One thing to consider when you're putting in a lithium ion battery, though, is that the charge controllers are not necessarily compatible between lithium ion and lead acid. Sometimes you get a charge controller that will do both, but more often than not, it's focused on the task at hand. If you buy a proprietary system where the charge controller, the battery, the inverter is all from the same manufacturer, essentially, then you don't have to worry about that. These things are going to be compatible. And increasingly, we're moving towards compatible or proprietary systems. So that's kind of jumping through chapter 6. I'll let you finish up chapter 5 on your own. Does anybody have any questions? If not, we'll call this a day, but I'm certainly willing to entertain any questions about life, the universe, and everything. Okay. I don't hear anything. So, all right. Well, during the week, if you have any questions, don't hesitate. I've been getting some emails from folks with specific questions on questions. So that's always good. But in the meantime, next week, we're going to start on chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the beast. That's where everything comes together.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, definitely. It's like half the course is all in chapter 7.
I'll
In the
probably have a
next
whole day in just that.
Yeah, in the next edition, I've split chapter 7 into 3 chapters. So
Nice.
same amount of material though. I mean, really. So just you get to pretend like you're making greater progress. Okay, all right. So that's gonna be it here for today. I see Christy's just come back. Do you have any questions before we call it a day here, Christy? You good? All right. Okay, well, I'll talk to you guys next week. And if you have any questions, just get in contact. All right. Take care.
All right.
Thanks, Jay.
Sure.